Festivus comes for two comedic icons. I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. Yes, it's a time for an airing of grievances between Bill Maher and Larry David. And it's a pretty good fight. Still, one in which I hate to pick sides. I have always been a Larry David fan. Truth be told, his portrait hangs in my radio studio for inspiration. There it is. It's personally inscribed. Michael, are you my Caucasian? A reference to one of my favorite Curb episodes ever. Crazy-Eyed Killer, if you remember. I've only met him once, but I've long admired his comedic genius, as evidenced in both Curb and in Seinfeld. My relationship with Bill Maher, that's a bit more fraught and complicated. The first time that I was a guest on Real Time, it was a total disaster. Look at that expression that he's giving to me. Bill took me for an evangelical Christian. It didn't end well. Please don't Google it. You'll only add to the count. At the post-show meet and greet that night, he came up to me and he said, "You look to me like a guy doing a slow burn." I love that expression. I hadn't heard it in years, but he was absolutely right. I was pissed. 2 weeks later, however, he gratuitously complimented me when I wasn't even a guest on the program. Eventually, I returned to the show several times and have come to respect his independence. Bill is no ideologue. He's a free thinker without any allegiance. The last time that I was on, he approached me post-show and he said, "You don't have a team." I like that. I don't have a team. And he's right. We have that in common. So it pained me to see two men that I respect greatly square off about Hitler, of all things. But I have to take sides. It all started with a dinner at the White House, and Bill explained as this.
As you know, 12 days ago, I had dinner with President Trump, a dinner that was set up by my friend Kid Rock, because we share a belief that there's got to be something better than hurling insults from 3,000 miles.
Bill Maher anticipated there was going to be criticism of his recap, and there was.
What I'm going to do is report exactly what happened. You decide what you think about it. And if that's not enough pure Trump hate for you, I don't give a fuck. Yeah!
Despite the fact that Maher made clear his areas of disagreement with President Trump, many were offended that he complimented him as a gracious dinner host. And he expressed an appreciation for not having to walk on eggshells around Trump, something that he said he probably would have had to have done with Presidents Clinton or Obama, both of whom he voted for. Maher went on to say that the man he met wasn't the man who seemed unhinged in public. He said that Trump laughed, he listened to criticism, he was more self-aware, and then Bill Maher said this.
A crazy person doesn't live in the White House. A person who plays a crazy person on TV a lot lives there, which I know is fucked up. It's just not as fucked up as I thought it was.
Okay, that's when the left exploded. There was widespread condemnation. Maher was called an easy mark. He was thought to be a shameless opportunist. A common feeling was that he got played by Trump. Larry David, a self-described social assassin, you remember that episode, he decided to step in. According to Patrick Healy, deputy opinion editor at the New York Times, David contacted the newspaper, said that he had a guest essay submission. The first line read as follows. "Imagine my surprise when in the spring of 1939, a letter arrived at my house inviting me to dinner at the old chancellery with the world's most reviled man, Adolf Hitler." Well, this gave the New York Times pause, explained Healy. Times opinion has a high bar for satire. Our mission is geared toward idea-driven, fact-based arguments, and we have a really high bar for commenting on today's world by invoking Hitler. As a general rule, we seek to avoid Nazi references unless that is the literal subject matter. Callbacks to history can be offensive, imprecise, or in terrible taste when you are leveraging genocidal dictators to make a point. But the Times ran Larry David's essay. They did so under the headline, "My Dinner with Adolf." It's about a visit with Hitler who turns out to be far more charming and funny than the narrator expected. Many of David's lines expressly echo Bill Maher's monologue. Quote, "I had been a vocal critic of his on the radio from the beginning, but eventually I concluded that hate gets us nowhere. Here I was, prepared to meet Hitler, the one I'd seen and heard, the public Hitler, but the private Hitler was a completely different animal. And oddly enough, this one seemed more authentic, like this was the real Hitler." It wasn't just a one-way street with the Fuhrer dominating the conversation. He was quite inquisitive and asked me a lot of questions about myself. And then when the visitor in this piece takes his leave of Hitler, he notes, quote, Although we disagree on many issues, it doesn't mean we have to hate each other. In an interview with Piers Morgan, Bill Maher fired back, noting that while he's never been soft on Trump, it's dumb to compare modern-day politicians to Hitler. And he added that the piece was kind of insulting, 6 million dead Jews, which was exactly what I thought. If Larry David had used another figure from history, I might be taking his side, but he didn't. He picked Hitler, for whom there are no equals, and for whom there should never be a comparison. As I said on radio, when David's piece was published, when references to Hitler or Nazis become too frequent, they water down the horror of the Holocaust. Jonathan Tobin, writing for the Jewish News Syndicate, made exactly the same point. Quote, "The way the discussion about the president always seems to circle back to Germany in the 30s and 40s is a glaring sign that efforts to educate Americans about the Holocaust have utterly failed. Those comparing Trump to Hitler aren't just guilty of hyperpartisanship and bad history, they're essentially reducing the worst crime in history of humanity to just another bitter political dispute that has nothing to do with the Nazis, totalitarianism, and mass murder." And lo and behold, the same day that Larry David's piece was published, former Vice President Al Gore made his own Trump-Nazi comparison, this time in the context of climate change. Gore's comments coincided with the annual observance of Yom HaShoah, the day set aside in the Hebrew calendar for remembrance of the Holocaust, which this year started the evening of April 23rd and continued through April 24. I took note of the fact that there was no outcry about Gore's invocation. Instead, it was just another day in Trump land. Not that Trump was the first to hear such a thing. George W. Bush was regularly compared to Hitler. Same for Reagan. And don't get me wrong, Biden, Obama, Clinton, they all got the Hitler treatment at different times, although the right tends to prefer calling Democrats communists or socialists. Indeed, the Hitler comparison goes all the way back to, well, Hitler. It makes you wonder who people utilized to represent evil before World War II. You can just imagine Larry David 100 years ago comparing President Coolidge to the Kaiser. The sort of attack has become so common it has a name. Argumentum ad Hitlerum. It's a type of ad hominem attack. Rather than discussing issues, you try to discredit your opponent by associating them with someone who's reviled. Indeed, fascist analogies have become so ubiquitous that attorney and author Mike Godwin came up with his famous law. If an online discussion goes on long enough, eventually someone will bring up a comparison to Hitler or the Nazis. Alas, even Godwin fell prey to that kind of thinking in the last election when he said it might be okay to compare Trump to Hitler. Sure, if you don't like a politician, you can always find some way they or their rhetoric is reminiscent of fascism, but you should show some sense of proportion. Perhaps we need a new law, something like people always think the last politician they don't like is worse than any that came before, when in truth, anyone with the slightest understanding of history knows the comparison is dumb. And it's ugly. And it's potentially dangerous. Gerald Posner wrote Case Closed, what many of us consider to be the definitive book on the assassination of the John F. Kennedy assassination. Writing for the Wall Street Journal just last year, he noted this: "It's a shame that those who repeatedly talked about Mr. Trump as an existential threat hadn't studied how the volatile atmosphere in 1963 in Dallas and 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, emboldened Lee Harvey Oswald and James Earl Ray to assassinate John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. There's a price to reckless speech that portrays public figures as threats to the American way of life. It can be the spark that helps to push an assassin to act. It is impossible to separate the violence of political assassinations in modern American history from the temperature of the times. It takes only a little fuel to push someone into the history books as an assassin." Bill Maher's points were well taken, in my view. As noted, it doesn't make the present-day politician look bad. Rather, it weakens Hitler and his status as being uniquely evil. Perhaps this is why Patrick Healy, the deputy opinion editor of the New York Times, claimed that Larry David was not actually equating Trump with Hitler, which I find hard to buy. If Trump isn't comparing to Hitler, then the comedy loses its bite in Larry David's piece, and the piece loses its point. And it's actually not a bad piece if you get beyond the misuse of Hitler. It makes its point humorously, we'd expect nothing less, and elegantly. And it's definitely worth noting that people can be taken in by charismatic figures, so why not try a different dictator for once? You've got Stalin and Mussolini and Mao, and that's just the 20th century. You could go old school and pick Caligula, although Trump might like that, based on the movie, of course. Yes, those names don't have the same bite, but if the piece doesn't work without Adolf, then it's clear you're letting the Hitler name do all the heavy lifting. So let me say to Larry David, soup Nazi, funny. Real Nazi, not so funny. In fact, here's a helpful flow chart that all can use to know when it's acceptable to compare a modern-day politician to Hitler. Should I compare this person to Hitler? No. Though Larry David has his point to make, so does Bill Maher, and it's probably more important. The left can oppose Trump as much as they want, but they shouldn't be afraid to see him as human. We need to learn it's possible to fight as hard as you can against someone's politics without dehumanizing them. You know who was famous for dehumanizing people? Well, I won't even give his name, but you can see how easy it is to fall into cheap comparisons. I'm sure Larry David will continue to do great work. Nobody is better at getting at the small things and getting them right. As a matter of fact, in this way, he reminds me of Donald Trump. Their politics couldn't be more different, but Trump's strength is putting his finger on those little issues that annoy people and yet tend to escape the notice of most politicians. Bill Maher said this.
I'm not the leader of anything, except maybe a contingent of centrist-minded people who think there's got to be a better way of running this country than hating each other every minute. So
maybe Bill Maher and Larry David will now have dinner. And if they do, I want Kid Rock's seat at the table.